It's nice to know that some of your families take water conservation so seriously that it sounds like weekly bathing is in order. Just make it on Saturday night. That's all we ask. In the late 60s, there was a set of books that came out, and it was they kind of pioneered a new way of writing, which was interesting to learn about. One of the things that these books did was they began to leave the end of the story open-ended. Now, earlier there was the choose-your-own-adventure style of children's book, where you could actually, to turn to a certain page if this is the decision that you want the character to go in. But this was a little bit different. It left the endings open to interpretation. And so as you read the book, it could be different. I mean, you could read the ending and have a totally different type of outcome as you interpret it from somebody else that read the book. Made for, I'm sure, very interesting book group conversations. Then, taking that idea, in the early 2000s, there were another few authors who did something even sort of more unique. They wrote books in such a way that they left the last few pages of the book blank, but with lines and a writing prompt that asked you to see yourself in the story and how would the story end accordingly. Now, I have never come across one of these books myself, but I think it's an interesting idea. Most of us, when we're reading something, whether it's a work of fact or fiction, like to envision ourselves in the story. How would we have reacted? How would we have responded? We can't help but see ourselves in the story in some way. The Jewish people have used this sort of way of imagining themselves in the text through the generations for a very, very, very long time. And there is no other probably greater meta-narrative in at least the Hebrew Bible than the story of the Passover. And every year the Passover is celebrated in Jewish homes, and the story is told, imagining themselves in the story. So let's go back real quick and do a little bit of a recap on what the story is all about. You may remember that God has come to Abraham and Sarah, and they made this promise about the descendants, and then several generations later, we get a man named Jacob, and Jacob has a dozen different sons, and then he's got one of the younger sons, the second to the youngest, a guy named Joseph, and the older brothers are jealous of him. And so they sell Joseph into slavery to this group of Midianites who carry him in a caravan in this human trafficking event down to Egypt. And he becomes a servant in Egypt. And because of his gift of interpreting dreams and because God's hand seems to be in this story all along, Joseph rises to prominence, and he ends up becoming really one of the right-hand men of the Pharaoh, the king of the whole Egyptian empire. Well, famine strikes at that time, and Joseph, because of his ability to interpret dreams, tells the Pharaoh, hey, you need to start storing up some of these grains because these years of plenty right now are going to be years of famine in the very near future, and if you want to make sure to avoid famine in Egypt, you need to follow along accordingly. And so Pharaoh surprisingly listens, and things go very well. Doesn't take long for Joseph's brothers and his extended family, the ones who sort of disowned him and sold him into slavery, to be struggling with famine up in the land of Canaan. And they make their way down to Egypt, looking for some assistance. Can we buy some of these rations? Can we take something home so that we don't starve? And through a wonderful round of storytelling, the story ends where the brothers and their families and their extended relatives all end up settling in Egypt, and so they make their home there. And they are there now for generations. In fact, it's very hard to kind of follow the biblical story and do the math on how many generations took place, but something between a few generations and several hundred years later, we end up with the next round of the story, which is that many pharaohs now have replaced the one who was in good relationship with this Hebrew named Joseph. And this new Pharaoh seems to have forgotten about their shared history. And the Hebrew people are now enslaved, and they become those who are making bricks and helping grow the empire and running all these building campaigns, and life is miserable for the Hebrew people, this group of Israelites. Enter into the story the birth of the next chosen individual who will help God's people. His name is Moses. And you may remember the story of baby Moses, and he's supposed to be cast into the river and drowned because the Pharaoh is so afraid of any of these Hebrew baby boys growing up and becoming a part of what may be an uprising against him. So he's set adrift into the river by his mother in a basket, and Pharaoh's daughter is there bathing, and she plucks the baby out of the river, and she names him Moses, and he is able to live this dual identity of being at one time somebody who grows up with the best that Egyptian life and royalty has to offer, but he is also one of the Israelites. Moses grows up, and one day he encounters one of the Egyptians brutally beating one of the Hebrew slaves. Moses somehow has this moment where he wants to intervene, and he gets involved, and he strikes the Egyptian so hard that it kills him. He knows then that he's a fugitive, and he runs off, and he flees, and he goes into the land of Midian. And he hangs out there, hopefully, he's thinking, without being pursued by the Egyptians, and there he'll get to live out the rest of his days. And so he's really making a life for himself as a stranger in a strange land. Then one day, he encounters this burning bush. And through the burning bush, he hears God speak to him, and God says, "Hey, I've got this special role for you. You are uniquely suited to go back into Egypt, and you are going to confront the new Pharaoh that is there, and you are going to tell him that it is time to release the enslaved people, the Israelites, and they are allowed to go. And if he doesn't let you and the people go, there will be severe consequences." And so this happens. The Pharaoh doesn't listen. There's a number of plagues that get brought upon Egypt. And then finally, the last and the final plague, the death of the firstborns of the Egyptians. And the Passover, as it's called, takes place. As the angel of death passes over the Egyptian homes, slaying the firstborns, but being prevented from wreaking any havoc on the Israelite families. Moses tells the people to pack up their things quickly. It's time to go. And so they make their way out into the countryside. They get to the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. They pass through because the sea is parted, the land is dry. They're able to pass through safely to the other side. And they begin to create what will be a new life in that moment. And every single year in the spring, at the time that the Jewish people celebrate the Passover, they gather with their families, and they gather around their dining room tables, and they celebrate something called the Seder meal. And it's a meal, but it's also an act of worship. It's a family worship service around the dining room table. And all of the family is there, and all the generations are gathered, and the service begins with the youngest child saying, "Why is it that we tell this story?" It's a scripted question, but it's a beginning to set the tone for the family is now beginning to see themselves as a continuation of this narrative that began millennia before their own existence. But the Jewish people now understand that they are writing their next chapter in their story as they read their origin stories together as a family, as they break bread, and as they celebrate this meal with elements on the table, food elements that are symbolic in so many ways of the telling of this story. It's a way of telling a story that the ending isn't already exactly determined. The last few pages are blank. Where will the family, where will the people, where will the Jewish community go with the story from here. You know, I've thought at times when I've read through the story at the Seder and the Passover, I've thought, wouldn't it be cool if we had something like that as Christians? I mean, wouldn't it be neat if we had that kind of a story where it was just we were the continuation, we were the next part of that story? What is our kind of initiation into this grand story, and where do we see ourselves written in as characters on this great unfolding narrative that continues to evolve and grow with the passage of time? And then I realized, of course, that we do. Yes, it's the gathering around the communion table, and it's the telling of the story of Jesus and the Last Supper. And whether or not we see ourselves as participants, as table guests, may be up to interpretation. I think that is part of what we should probably strive to understand. But there's another part that I think comes even much earlier in our understanding and our identity, and that is in the act of baptism. Baptism, after all, is something that invites us to recognize God's claim on our lives, to pass through the waters, as it were, and to emerge on the other shore as different people than when we started. We don't normally talk about baptism in that way, do we? We talk about the other parts of baptism. We talk about it as a spiritual cleansing. We talk about it as an initiation into the church. We talk about it as a death and a resurrection. But all of those things are absolutely true. And yet there is also this other piece of it that involves the event that says, we were those people and we are moving into this new part of who we are with a future that is yet unwritten completely. We know where we have been, and yet we are not exactly sure where we are going, but we know that we are not the same today as we were back then. And it's not something that is a new idea either. And in fact, as I was doing more research, I uncovered some things where actually this has been a part of the church's tradition all along. I had not equated the Exodus and baptism as things that sort of were complementary to each other. But in fact, this is the way that has been discussed and described in the church for a very long time. Let's take a look at some of these ancient writings and some of the early thoughts around this. We have an example from 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul sharing with us, I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud. You remember when Stephen read this passage from Exodus about the pillar and the cloud? Under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now, I think that passage could be very confusing, but when you think about baptism as a way of passing through God's claim on our lives and leading us safely through the transition of what we were to what we are becoming, I think that this is a powerful metaphor, an example for us. All right, let's go on to another one from the 2nd century. So now we're talking very, very early, right? This is before the Bible as we know it even came into existence. That the mystery of the Passover was a type of Christ has been demonstrated to you, as also that of the Red Sea was a type of baptism. Justin Martyr was someone who grew up in what is today known as Nablus in the West Bank, but he was a very learned person who grew up in the school of Greek philosophy and thought, but when he couldn't find all of the answers to his faith, and he couldn't find Greek mythology and the pursuit of knowledge to satisfy all of his deep yearnings for what it is as our purpose and what is we're supposed to be as created individuals, he found those answers in the Christian faith. And so he pursued those to the point in defending his faith, even to the point of martyrdom. All right, the next one from Origen, also another early Christian martyr from Alexandria in Egypt. The crossing of the sea is a figure of baptism. All who pass through the waters of baptism leave the devil, as it were, drowned behind them. Egypt is left behind. Pharaoh's power is destroyed. and the Christian emerges free on the other shore, singing a song of salvation. Jay, could you just leave that one up for a little bit? I want us to hold on to that thought. Because what we see in baptism is this transformation happening. It is recognizing that we are leaving behind that part of what we were, and we are making a purposeful progression to what it is that we are becoming in the unknown future. This is where we get included and incorporated into the bigger story. Now, the hard thing for a lot of us as adults, and for a lot of us who were baptized as babies, as is very often the case for a lot of us United Methodists and Roman Catholics and Lutherans, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians, and so forth. Right? There are many of us who were baptized as infants, and so the idea of being able to remember our baptism is a challenging thing. Most of us don't remember our baptism. If you remember your baptism as an infant, let's have a talk. I'm fascinated by your recall. But that's why when we celebrate a baptism in the church, as we have done several times over the past few months, as we're going to have 2 baptisms next Sunday, as we're going to have a baptismal remembrance and reclamation 2 weeks from now, and then we're going to have more baptisms in the next month. This seems to be a season of baptism at the church, but one of the things that is so special is that as we gather at the font, you remember that there is the part in the service, in the liturgy, or if it's me officiating, I will ask the parents or the person being baptized to take their baptismal vows, and they are stating their intention to have Christ lay claim to their life and their desire to die to what was and to be resurrected to what they are becoming. But then there's the part where we as the congregation get to participate in the service. And I ask, will all of you do all in your power, by God's grace, do your part to nurture, to strengthen, to encourage, to assist this family in nurturing this child in the faith? Or if it's an adult, will you serve them in the process? And will you remember your own baptism today? Not that you are able to remember your baptism, but in the sense that the Jews remember the Passover and the Exodus, we are asked to go back to remember the story and to remember our place in it. To take our vows, to share them again, and to say, these things matter to me every bit now as they did when my parents, or when I was younger, or when those who took these vows on my behalf said them for me. And when we re-enter into that story and into that covenant, it's an opportunity for us to remember God's ongoing work. Because we are people, as I said at the beginning of the service, who are people that choose light over darkness. We choose to cling to our faith and trust in God's guidance with us. Whether we see that as a pillar and a cloud, or whether we see that as Christ walking beside us, the same idea is true. It means that when we experience the hell of weeks like we have been through as a nation, and when we see the tragedy and the evil around us, that we are not going to succumb to those things, but we are instead going to remember what Origen said, that as we go through some of those darkest times and some of those most painful experiences, because God is with us and guiding us through the process, we will emerge to the other side. There will be life beyond this. There will be resurrection as a response to crucifixion and death. And so I want to encourage you, each of us, as we think about what baptism looks like in the celebration of the 2 baptisms next Sunday, and remembering our baptisms 2 weeks from today, and celebrating with those who are reclaiming their baptismal vows a few weeks from now, take these sacred moments to remember that this is more than just the thing that we go through when there's a new baby in the church, or when there is an adult who comes to Christianity and we celebrate that, or when there's a child who is confirming their baptismal vows. The same thing is true that this is a part of telling our story. It is entering back into an ancient story that existed far beyond any of us can scarcely comprehend. And the final pages of this story are still left blank on purpose. But we know that with God guiding us, we know that with the one who leads us faithfully through the fire, through the floods, through the parted sea, we will be able to have a richer and better new story because we are transformed and resurrected from Jesus Christ by his power, by his grace, and by his goodness. Therefore, we can see ourselves written into and entering into this great story that we have the great blessing to be a part of. Let's pray.